What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, Manny Maradiege, live on July the 12th to close out the week surrounding some more stories in the NFL. We're going to look at a lot of statements, a lot of fascinating statements on a variety of topics that I thought would be interesting to discuss on today's show. Starting off with 49ers tight end George Kittle, talking about how he sees an 18-game regular season playing out and some of his thoughts to improve it or just pitch it as a better idea to some of the other players in the NFL. Then we're going to look at a conversation between Giants general manager Joe Schoen and Saquon Barkley, sort of their last pitch to try to get him to stay in New York, and just my thoughts on it, how that broke out, and just basically that, how they talked to each other, his pitch to Saquon. It was very interesting on that part, and also more on the Giants. A Giants linebacker, Bobby Okereke, talks about the new look that the Giants defense could have in 2024 with a new defensive coordinator coming in. He's expecting big changes, and it should lead to big changes after last year and putting out a poor performance. So those topics and more coming up on today's show. Before I get started, I wanted to remind you guys, if you have any questions or comments, please use the tip and donations link you see on your screen, gsmcpodcast.net. Use that tip and donations link and I'll be able to see your question or comment, and that way I'll read it out loud and get your guys' thoughts on anything I say or on any of the topics. It's a big help for the show and the network as well, so if you would, please use the tip and donations link, gsmcpodcast.net. But that allows me now to move into the first segment, the 18-game regular season. We've heard a lot from a lot of different players, but George Kittle brought up some pretty interesting points on the Rich Eisen show this week that I very much agree with, and it was just interesting to see his perspective on a lot of things. So one of the first things he brought up was just the idea of how inevitable it seems. I've touched on it. It almost seems like if the NFL wants to do something, more often than not, they're going to get their way. They have a lot more power, these owners. If they all come together and they all agree on something, it's most likely going to happen. And that's what George Kittle started off with by saying, number one, it's inevitability. First, going to get 18 games at some point, right? And I think I've said it ever since we got to 17 games. I was like, just give us 2 byes, going off of what Joe Burrow said and what we talked about with Joe Burrow earlier this week. Added that more players would be okay with it if they had 2 byes included in this new plan for 18 games. The biggest thing, obviously, is that rest that players would love to have with another game. It's obviously going to get some backlash. A lot of players are going to speak out about it. But adding that other bye, I think it should prove as a point that players are going to be more easily swayed if they just have more off time. And also, you could look at the idea of adding, maybe in some scenario, pitching out maybe more bye weeks, like 3 or 4. If that could be in a range where that could happen. If you add one, like Joe Burrow said, we'll take the week 13 bye, almost like an all-star break like the NBA has. You have one there and another one that's scheduled some other time for each team. Then maybe you could look to have another one right before the playoffs for all those teams that are having to play all those extra games, having to play those 18 weeks, and then on top of that, the playoffs. You can have a week before the playoff starts, have everybody off for a certain amount of time or longer, and then you can get more into the swing of things. That could be another option, to add sort of 3 bye weeks there for almost the teams that have earned it by making the playoffs. It's just something to think about. Maybe they try to pitch that out there, but I find it a little hard to believe that the NFL will go for 3 bye weeks, but it doesn't hurt to try. They're, of course, going to try and get more of a revenue split, but again, that's also going to be extremely hard, prying that away from the NFL. But George Kittle also talked about, with the addition of the resting your body, getting your bodies right, because 16 games was already hard, in his opinion. Then they moved to 17 games, and that was really hard to do. And now 18 games with only 1 bye week is almost impossible to not only have everybody out there, but putting out the best product, which is something I assume the NFL really cares about. Not only putting out more content, but the quality of it has to be up to standards, or else people are not going to get the best impression if these games are ugly or if these games don't have all the biggest stars playing because they're all injured. The NFL wants to try to avoid that, wants to find a balance there. So definitely adding more rest, at least 2 buys, is something I would expect to happen. But more so than that, talking about the offseason changes that could also happen, George Kittle was asked about it, and he gave his thoughts on it as well, on that new potential offseason structure that was posted a while ago back, a few weeks ago now. And he said this, as you guys see on your screen. If you play throughout the entire playoffs, you're playing into mid-February, and you're supposed to show up on April 15th for phase 1 of OTAs. That's pretty aggressive, right? Like, that's not a lot of time for your body to heal, regenerate, to let your mind and your body both rest. And he also added on after that he's pretty much okay with getting rid of OTAs, or just showing up in May, or just having some players show up in May is what I meant. Or just having a 2-week mini camp is something else he threw out just in the month of May for the players that are new. Obviously, they need that transition period to get through it. Adding those guys in, only them to show up, not the veteran guys that don't really have to be there, could be something that the NFL could look into. Or also, if you're just new to a team or something like that, he said you could also show up in May, and that could also be an option to get you more up to speed on things if you're joining a new team, or if you're still relatively new, second year, third year, fourth year guys. That could be very beneficial to them. So I kind of agree with what he said. I really am on the stance that this period is really more so for the new guys. So if there could be something there, at least for the rookies and the new guys, like 4-year players, 3-year players in, that would be the best case scenario for me, because phase 1 through phase 2 or 3, I believe, are all voluntary until you get up until June, like we just finished off with mandatory minicamp. A lot of veteran players just skip out. They feel like they could have a better preparation at home through their own training, through their own gyms, through their own workout routines. So it's voluntary anyway. So if they're not going to show up, they are very much in their right to not show up. But then they get this negative connotation of being away from the team. What is going through their minds by not showing up. Everybody reads more into it when at the end of the day it is voluntary. So it's kind of like a double meaning there. You don't have to be there, but people expect you to be there anyway, and then they almost talk bad about you in some conversations if you don't show up there. Like Micah Parsons missed a lot of times through OTAs, but he wasn't supposed to be there. But again, people really looked into it as to why he didn't show up, why he felt that it wasn't necessary to show up. So that could eliminate it if the NFL does change the offseason structure a little bit, which could be beneficial to some players. George Kittle also talked about being in favor of the ramp-up period that was pitched by the NFLPA, ramping it up a little bit in June, not having the early phase 1, phase 2 voluntary workouts, just having a ramp-up period in middle of July. Then you can get right into training camp without having that long break that we currently are in right now. He was in favor of it, and I was as well. I thought that was something that if you don't really start football until, say, June or early July, like he's mentioning there, and you ramp it up towards the middle of July, I think that's enough time from the last game of the season in February all the way up until June, mid-June or late June, or however they schedule it. That's a good amount of time rather than just 2 months, 2.5 months from February to April when you have to show back up again on April 15th. It's just something to think about for some players. But also in the same breath, it's only 2 teams that play until mid-February. So just to play devil's advocate, it's not the majority. The majority of the league is already home by December or the start of January. So they really have 4 months to get back into the swing of things. It's only 2 teams that really make it to February. So balancing that out a little bit and seeing the benefits and the negatives of that could also just play into that conversation. But also, April to May, it just seems like it is too much overall on my final thoughts on this. Starting back in April is pretty much no time off, and that's a big thing. Obviously, if you're going to add another game and you're already pushing the season back, a week further back now into February, you're really having no time for these players to rest. So if I were to choose a side, I would agree with George and sort of have it be pushed at least until the end of May, the start of June, before you make it absolutely mandatory for some of these workouts to start. But again, I would love to see the rookies, some of the new guys start probably in early May, April maybe. April probably for the rookies. Or actually scratch that because the draft is in late April. So for the rookies, probably sometime in mid-May, having them go probably from mid-May to June, and then the veterans can start filing in, and then you can get that ramp-up period on your way as well. So that's something to think about with this conversation with the 18-game regular season. But for right now, it is pretty much in the works as of right now. Nothing really being solidified with that. It was interesting because the NFLPA, according to some reports, have been starting to anticipate these talks starting to ramp up in the next few weeks, or at least intensify a lot more at some point throughout the season. So there's been a lot of talk about it, but now some players are getting the inclination that it could start to happen at some point in this season. So I wouldn't be surprised if more of this starts to gain some traction and we get some movement on it some point during the regular season. More people start to talk about it as we go on. But that's what George Kittle thought about it, pretty much on the more positive side of things compared to some of his own teammates and some of the other players that were really against it. But we'll see. We'll see how they come to a compromise. They are still pretty much on the early stages of a new CBA. This is probably going to require them to renegotiate an entire new CBA, so it's going to take a while, but those talks are probably going to start relatively soon. Leave your guys' thoughts on where you stand on the offseason changes and whether or not you like the 18-game regular season idea as well. But with that being said, we will move on with our first break of the show, and when we return, a lot of talk around the New York Giants. First, we're going to take a more in-depth look at that conversation between their general manager, Joe Schoen, and Saquon Barkley that ended up leading him into free agency, and then from that point signs with Philadelphia. What was said and my thoughts on it are coming up right after this break. You're listening to the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows with 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits, some losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip, you choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Right back into the action on the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast. A lot of talk around the New York Giants in this episode, in this segment, and the following. First, we're going to look at that second episode of Hard Knocks that dropped this past Tuesday. And it had a lot more to do with that conversation that finally led into Saquon Barkley ending up in free agency. Something that was it seemed almost impossible talking about this probably like 2 or 3 years ago with the contract, coming up for Saquon, the contract talks coming up for him. You never really thought it could get to this point, especially after they franchise tag them. Usually when teams do that, you can see their intention of really wanting to keep the player, and oftentimes when they do that, I feel like they do relinquish the power a little bit, or almost just relinquish the idea that they want to keep him. They want to keep him, They franchise tag him just to have a little bit of extra time, and they usually end up giving in to the players' wants. But it is interesting with the running backs, obviously, because around the market and how devalued it's become. And with Saquon, he was looked at it like that, but also I feel like the Giants failed to realize that, Saquon isn't like other running backs. I think teams really like to group all these running backs in and feel like they're all going to get injured past the age of 26 or 27. And I just think that's almost not fair to these running backs. A lot of them, I could admit that a good amount of them probably drop off by 27, 28 potentially. But even then, I feel like you have to make a difference and draw a line between the majority, your average running back that's good, that's solid, that could get you around 900, 1,000 yards. But then you get into the very few, like a Saquon or a Christian McCaffrey or maybe even a Derrick Henry in his day and age. But really, in my opinion, it's only Christian and Saquon that are in that group. And that's why I felt that these talks, these efforts by the New York Giants really didn't do Saquon the fairness and the justice that he deserved because of everything that he put into the Giants. It just left a bad taste in my mouth. And I'm not even a Giants fan to have some sort of connection to how this all broke down, but it just felt fishy and it just felt like they didn't do Saquon right. And he moved on. He signed with Philadelphia this offseason. But talking about the specifics of their conversation, from episode 1, we knew that the franchise tag wasn't really going to happen because of the fact that they already did it before, and the potential $7 million salary that they wanted to offer him. It was a thought, but general manager Joe Schoen didn't want to go through with it just because of the idea that if he did go through with it, he would have been looked at as disrespecting Saquon, almost like, how dare you offer him this little of money. But that's where the running back market is now. Teams are pretty scared and pretty intimidated to pay more than $8-9 million for a 27-year-old running back. But now, leading into episode 2, you saw a brief conversation between general manager Joe Schoen and also assistant general manager Brandon Brown. And they talked initially about how they were going to try and convince Saquon of trying to stay. You had Joe Schoen talking to Brandon Beane almost in a way that he would want to talk to Saquon, or almost giving out his actual thoughts about what he thought about Saquon and their pitch to try and keep him. In that statement, it was a brief statement that he said. He said, as you guys can see here, "Hey, here is our price. You want your name up here forever. 2 more years, you're in the Ring of Honor, or you want $1 million more to go somewhere else." Joe Schoen said that to Brandon Brown, but that was actually never said directly to Saquon, but you kind of got an idea of how their mindset was at this time. And I did find it fascinating because you're trying to pitch him that idea of being a Giant forever, being that guy that stayed with the franchise through the tough times, being looked at as this hero who loved just the organization. But at the same time, I feel like they were overly secure, obviously, in that sentiment, or at least Joe Schoen was, just because in his statement he says, or you want $1 million more to go somewhere else. And he actually ended up getting about $5 to $4 million more in his deal with the Philadelphia Eagles. So he was pretty much set in that mindset that nobody in their right mind would pay Saquon over $10 million. He pretty much had the idea that the running back market was going to be as how he planned it out to be, at least in his mind, and how they were approaching Saquon with a new deal. And I talked about it last week, actually believing that nobody out of the 31 other teams that are out there, nobody was going to offer Saquon a double-digit salary is pretty ridiculous to actually believe that. Because once you offer him, once you put him on the market, it's free range. Nobody has any hesitancy to go after Saquon or pitch him anything at that point. With the franchise tag, you had a little bit of protection, and not offering it to him at that point and putting him just on the free market. I'm sure a lot of teams looked at each other like, Like, are these guys serious? Putting Saquon up there for free. And then they took advantage of it, the Eagles did, and it really led off from this thought. And then you actually get into the conversation he had with Saquon, and that one was a little bit just more, was more like he was trying to gaslight Saquon a little bit. And I'll show you what I mean with what he said in that conversation. Mostly JioSaavn just talking to Saquon, really saying, the right thing to do is let you test the market to see what your value is. I don't want to do the franchise thing or that stuff again. I don't want to go through that. We've both been through that. If you really want to be a Giant for life and you're interested in coming back, see what your market is and have Ed come back to us, and we'll see if we can come to an agreement. Then Saquon Barkley said, all right, that's cool. We're going to do that. Then before they get off of the phone, you can kind of see JioSaavn a little bit rattled is the way that it's the word that comes up to me right now when he says, can you give me your word on that, or are you not going to give us a chance? At that point, you really see, I think for the first time in these first two episodes, that he kind of comes to the realization that, Saquon could actually really leave. Saquon wasn't really giving him much back in terms of conversation. It was very short answers. And then at that moment, it seemed like he really realized that this could actually be the last of it, the last time Saquon is actually considered a Giant. That's why you almost get that last word out there, like almost saying, do you promise you're going to at least give us a chance? Do you promise you're at least going to show us the offer? But at that point, I can almost see how Saquon could take it. I'm just assuming, obviously. But for everything that he's done, for everything that he meant to this organization, especially drafting him number 2 overall, going through the injuries, being the face of the team, through all the really bad times, for them to offer him $7 million and then letting him test the free agent market, almost like insinuating that he's going to come crawling back to them, it makes me think, like, why would I give you my word if you're going to value me this low for everything that he did throughout his time there, setting a bunch of records, being as prolific as he has been, for them to offer him $7-8 million and then just still let him walk? All Saquon said was, I already told you where I wanted to be, so he was going to take the opportunity to hit the free agent market, and luckily for him, he signed that deal with the Eagles 8 days later, 3 years, $37 million, and the biggest thing about it was $26 million guaranteed, which is huge for a running back this day and age in that market. To get that sort of money, with everything that the Giants were showing him, and then for this opportunity to show up in a running back market like it is right now, I don't blame Saquon for taking it. He might have felt a certain way about the Giants, but you can't pass up an opportunity like that, regardless if it's the Giants or the Cowboys who were offering. Saquon probably would have had a tough time saying no to either, and he accepted the one from the Eagles. He moved on, and now we find ourselves where we are right now. In this conversation, not talking about just the Giants and how this all broke out, but it gave a good insight on how some of these hard conversations really go, and how honest they could be, and just how just raw they could be at times when you see an organization that have really gotten a lot from this player. He has done a lot for this team. For them to still be relevant a little bit, a big part has been for Saquon and for all that he's done, and you would at least anticipate that they would have offered him something. A lot of fans don't get the insight that Hard Knocks does provide, so seeing this and getting an explanation for how Saquon actually ended up away from your team, if you're a Giants fan, it really opens up a lot of eyes, and you can see into the behind the scenes of why this is really truly a business in some aspect, and you have to make some really hard decisions. And I feel like the Giants were wrong in this. I don't think that's any surprise to anyone. But at the end of the day, with how it all broke down, with how he was talking to Saquon, it just makes me think like it was just a preservation attempt to try and get him to come back, knowing that you made a wrong decision already, but you're already handcuffed to it. Trying to get Saquon to come back with this last-ditched attempt was pretty interesting to see, and how he actually try to break it down to Saquon and how maybe he truly believed that this could happen. But again, I've said it before, paying Daniel at the end of the day, they've made that decision. So now they were faced with this hard reality, and it ended up how it did. Obviously, there was a chance he could have gone somewhere else. If you were to lose him, you didn't want to lose him to the Eagles, but that's how it ended up happening. And now there's a lot of expectations going into this season. And now moving on from Saquon, you got a new running back in. It's a prove-it year for Daniel Jones. You have to just swallow this pill and just move forward with the decisions that you make. And hopefully it turns out all right for them, because they did improve. I like Malik Neighbors coming in. I like the young pass rushers that they have, or the young pass rushers and the young pass catchers as well. But it's hard to be optimistic when you lose a generational player like Saquon was for this team. But we'll see how this plays out. The episodes have been pretty good for Hard Knocks already. So I will be definitely seeing more of these episodes as they are released every Tuesday in this month. But that'll be it for the offensive side of the ball for the Giants. We're going to quickly transition into a break, and then on the other side, we're going to talk about the other side of the football for the Giants as well. In a bit more of a positive light, linebacker Bobby Okereke is very optimistic about their new defensive coordinator, Shane Bowen, and what he's bringing to that side of the ball and how he expects to make a massive jump in 2024 to at least help this team out on the defensive side of the ball. Stay tuned to find out what he said and why this team could be a lot better on defense next season. We'll be right back after this break.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
We are back here on the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast to talk some more about the New York Football Giants, more positively this time, around their defense, because it's looking definitely better than their offense, at least in my opinion it is. Not because of how the offense is looking in comparison to the defense, but just because last year this New York Giants defense was arguably just as bad, because they were allowing the sixth most total touchdowns per game at 361. They were also at the bottom of the NFL, allowing the seventh most points per game at about 24 points per game as a defense. And because of that, they moved on from their old defensive coordinator, Wink Martindale, and they brought in the former defensive coordinator for the Tennessee Titans in Shane Bowen. And I personally didn't know too much about Shane Bowen, but so far through OTAs and mandatory minicamp, he has received a lot of praise, and now we got a chance to see why that was and what he is bringing to this team, a little bit out of the mind of Bobby Okereke. The linebacker for the New York Giants appeared on the Up and Adams show this past week to talk about the differences he's already noticing from Wink Martindale's defense to now with Shane Bowen. He said it's almost about as 180 of a flip as it can be. Going from Wink, I loved that system, attacking, blitzing all the time, to Shane, very methodical, probably one of the most cerebral defensive coordinators I've ever been around. Just the way he sees the game, the way he's gonna call it, the way he coaches it, the attention to detail. Yeah, I think we're gonna dominate this year, and it's gonna be led by him. And those are pretty strong words to describe this defense. Saying that you're going to dominate is a great goal to have, is a great mindset to have, because they do have the pieces. I do like saying that they brought in a lot of pieces that I did like Jordan Phillips, the defensive tackle from Buffalo, Brian Burns, obviously trading for him. They drafted Tyler Nubin, which I thought was huge after losing Xavier McKinney. You bring in another young top safety in the draft. I really like that addition. He seems like he's ready, one of the players that was ready to play right now. And you also signed Jalen Mills from the New England Patriots to add some talent to that secondary, and really just at all levels of the defensive line, the linebacker position, and the secondary as well. And with how Okereke is talking about this defense, it's looking very optimistic, at least because in comparison to last year, being 6th in the most total yards allowed per game, 7th in the most points per game allowed as well, it's hard to be worse than those numbers, you know? Even if it's a passing league, even if the NFL is pushing for more points on the board, it's hard to be worse than that. So in comparison to that, I feel like they are going to get better. The Titans had a very solid defense last year, even though they were in a weird period with it being the last year for Mike Vrabel, and they were just in a new spot with a new quarterback coming in, Hopkins coming in. There was a lot of moving pieces. The defense still was all right for them, and now he comes over to, I think, a more talented defense with already having Kayvon Thibodeau, Dexter Lawrence, Bobby Okereke on there as well. They have some interesting pieces where they could definitely do something with and make it look a little bit more solid with it in 2024. And I think it's much needed. I think it's much needed because there's a lot of tension around this building right now, with Hard Knocks infiltrating this team, really giving everybody an insight on what the operations are look like, and sort of explaining some of these reasons why the Giants let Saquon walk, why they paid Daniel Jones, why they're making these trades. They're getting an inside look at all of that, and I think from some of the fans and just from play in general, there's a lot of tension surrounding the Giants, especially heading into this season. It's going to be a big one. There's a lot of expectations to at least see some life out of this team next season. Like I mentioned with everything, it's a prove-it year for Daniel Jones. Saquon left. Brian Dable and Joe Shane, what's their status going to look like if they have another poor year? Will the Giants actually move on from Brian Dable, move on from both of them, keep Brian Dable, move on from Joe Shane? All of that right now is in the air, and it looks to be like the main focus is on the offense, right? Because all the attention goes to the quarterback, and because the NFL is a passing league, that's what brings in the most stories. If your offense, it almost seems like if your offense is putting up less than 18 points per game or 17 points per game minimum, the alarm bells are going off. The national media is focusing in on your team. What's wrong with the offense? Why is it so bad? This day and age, you have to score almost close to 20 points per game as the minimum to be seen as a decent team. And the Giants weren't really there last year, obviously, on offense. And now there's a lot of new pieces coming in, a lot more expectations for them to at least show some more life. How could they alleviate some of that? What could help them and at least save them in some of these games is probably going to be the defense. And that's where I get into this question now that I started thinking of when I was making and preparing for this segment was, let's say the Giants defense is actually like really good. If they're actually up there, top 12, maybe top 10, do I dare say, in the NFL, those are pretty lofty goals if they're going to dominate like Okereke says. I think if they get up to top 10, top 12, that would be extraordinary for this team to get back to playing absolutely great defense. But the question is, can a top defense like that, top 10, top 12, is that going to be able to cover up and mask some of the offensive deficiencies if they do continue to happen in 2024? So Daniel Jones is still not looking great. Malik Neighbors really isn't getting the ball. He's frustrated. The running game's not really there, moving on from Saquon. If their offense just continues to stutter in 2024, will a very dominant top 10 defense be able to cover that up and sort of extend this period of judgment, per se, for the New York Giants past 2024? It was a pretty tough one when I was thinking about it, just because I want to say yes, because your defense is really good, and I think it stands out more because it is a passing league and it is so offense based and offense heavy. But in that same breath, the Giants have really been dancing around the fact that they made a wrong choice with Daniel Jones, I believe, and now they're giving him this extra year. Well, not extra year because it is in his contract, but a lot of teams or a lot of people in the NFL felt that this year was the year to move on from Daniel Jones. There was all those reports saying that the Giants were done with him, but now you're seeing Joe Shane on Hard Knocks saying that this is the prove-it year for him. They got to give him a chance at least. So now you're extending it a little bit further, maybe causing some more frustration within the fan base and just within the city overall for all the Giants fans in the city. So I think this has been extended a little bit longer than most would have hoped for, and I don't think a top 10 defense will really be able to cover up if this offense is really bad. Like, if this offense, again, is putting up 15 points, 16 points per game, no more than that, I don't think a top defense will really be able to save you at that point, just because in that same breath that I'm saying, in the same breath that I said that a top defense could, show out a little bit more because everyone's putting up points, and if your defense is stopping them, people could look at it more and say, wow, like, they must be really good because this team is putting up 20 consistently, and now when they play the Giants, they're really struggling. But in that same breath, that could only hold up for so long. Offenses are almost too good now all over the league where you can only hold a team for so long before your offense, or your defense is out there for 60, 70% of the game, and fatigue starts to set in by that third quarter. You might not be getting blown out, but at the same time, your defense is starting to get tired. They don't have that same pop, and you're giving up scores, you're giving up leads, you're losing the game towards the end of the game a lot more often, and then that might be even more frustrating then because you've stayed within the confines of the game. You're not getting blown out. Your defense has been keeping you in it the majority of the game, but you're still losing them in the end by letting up a score, your offense not being able to respond, and all that sort of thing. I don't think it'll really mask anything for the Giants if they're not putting up points and if they're not winning, especially because I don't have their record from last year, but obviously it wasn't a good one. It was another disappointing season. So if they don't drastically improve from that, if they don't get to at least 500 or a game above 500, I think the writing is pretty much already on the wall. So I feel like people are knowing that this year's probably going to be the last year for Daniel, for maybe Brian Dable. They already have that in their minds. So if you don't really do something to drastically change that, offensive-wise, it's not going to be enough for this defense to save you. It's going to keep you in games, so that could be encouraging, but that could be just a gateway to the next phase of this, to the next regimen that comes in. A new head coach that comes in, Bill Belichick is out there. He seems to be the favorite. So having a great defense this year is great and all, but it could just be a great stepping stone and a good thing to have for the next head coach to come in because, again, the offense nowadays has to be good enough to at least put up 20 points, 19 points for you just to get by, just for you to really have a chance in this league. Not a lot of teams are averaging less than 17 or 18 points a game. You find it very rare that they are, and if you are and you're somehow still winning, it's almost a miracle at that point. But I just don't see the Giants' defense, one, being able to be that good already just in his first year as a defensive coordinator for Shane Bowen. Their pieces are nice. They have a great defensive line on paper, but I have to see it. They have a lot of young pieces on that defense as well, so I have to see how efficient it is. It might not even be up there, so I'm just assuming at that point for the sake of the question, their defense could be middle of the league, maybe towards the 20s, and then you really have a problem because you can't stop anybody and your offense might not be able to keep up anyway. So I'm hoping for the best outcome with a better defense like Bobby Okereke is suggesting because they do have good players, but thinking big picture, thinking of how the Giants could move on with this as a positive, it doesn't seem like it'll be enough for me to mask the offense if it is just performing as well as it did last year. Then we get into a whole new conversation about finding a new quarterback and all that stuff that just gets drawn out. But that's how I feel about it. It's looking more promising on the defensive side. I will give the Giants that. But how much really is it going to help this team in 2024? We're just going to have to wait and see. But again, we're going to go to our next break. We're going to leave that topic there. I'm sure I'm going to touch on it later on. We have 2 more segments to talk about regarding Josh Jacobs and him really going at his former team, the Las Vegas Raiders, blasting them for their losing mentality and why he felt that it was just not going to work with how they were thinking over there in Las Vegas. And staying on the topic of running backs, Rachaad White in Tampa Bay, we're going to talk about the goals that he has in 2024, and if he reaches those goals, are the Tampa Bay Buccaneers good enough to repeat as NFC South champions? Those 2 topics are coming up in just a few seconds. Don't go anywhere.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Welcome back here to the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast to discuss another running back, or the first running back, I should say, on today's show at least. Josh Jacobs, now a Green Bay Packer. Very good move for the Packers to make, especially if Aaron Jones wasn't going to work in renegotiating his contract and keeping him in Green Bay. You have a very capable replacement and arguably a better running back for some people in Josh Jacobs. You did sign him to about $12 million salary. So how that plays out throughout the entirety of those 4 years will be something to monitor. But why and how did this all happen? I touched on it before on the differences that Josh Jacobs has already noticed by being on the Packers compared to Las Vegas. But talking about why he actually left, what made it about the Las Vegas Raiders and where they were heading, what did he see over there that really was the final straw to make this decision and move on in free agency. He talked about it on the Green Light podcast with Chris Long, and he brought up he didn't really hold back at all, which surprised me a little bit with how hard he went at his former team by saying the following. I have it up here to show you guys. This is the first thing he said, talking about, being drafted by the Raiders. He said, "Coming from Alabama, I went to a championship every year. I was there. I remember coming to the league and losing my first game, and I was mad and not talking to nobody. A vet came up to me and was like, 'This is the NFL. You're going to lose.' I'm like, 'So y'all cool with losing?' It was so different." And from that standpoint, it's hard to argue with him. It's hard to bring that up, or actually not just bring it up, but also just see from that point. And it is a reality, really talking generally about what that statement was said with that veteran player. With him saying that at that point in time to Josh Jacobs, I'm sure it was a surprise to him, but at the same time, the Raiders were in a weird spot. Josh Jacobs was really that first building block, that first piece to this big puzzle that the Raiders had envisioned when they drafted him back in 2019. He was supposed to be that first piece to this offense, building everything around him. Then you find a quarterback, you find a receiver, you start building it up through there. But on that point, it is a hard transition to not defend Josh Jacobs on, because a lot of Alabama players come from unrealistic success at Alabama, especially during his time there with Nick Saban. Nobody could touch them. They were the best of college football. He had the dynasty of dynasties over there, Nick Saban, with that team, and all the talent that he poured into the NFL year in, year out, with all of his players, and how ready he got them to play. But a lot of them probably went to bad teams. A lot of them probably went to bad situations for how early they were drafted. And Josh Jacobs at that time was drafted to the Raiders, and they were 7-9 in his rookie year. Then they were 8-8 in 2020, and they didn't have their first winning season with Josh Jacobs until 2021, where it was his first winning season in his third year. So you can imagine having to wait that long and only be 10-7 and probably not make it too far into the playoffs, if at all, is super frustrating for Josh Jacobs at that point. And coming from where he was coming from, it is a tough pill to swallow. I do acknowledge that, but at the same time, it does come with a grain of salt just because he is coming into a situation where the NFL is a lot different from college. You're not going to be blowing teams out by 20, 30 each game just because you're at Alabama. So I do see both sides of it, but the next quote that Josh Jacobs said really drew me in when he said, "The most frustrating thing about it all, you've got me and Tay and Max. You've got guys who come in every day and work hard, and you don't get the results. You'll be close every year, but not winning. You want me to come back on a discount and lose? I don't know how I feel about that." And that part is really what sets it apart from everything, just because it makes sense. It makes sense from that standpoint because Josh Jacobs, you can accept losing. You can accept losing, and you can accept being one of the first pieces to this entire thing and knowing that it's not going to look great right now. Heck, it might even look awful, terrible right now with how we're performing out there on the field. But when we start getting into these contract negotiations, once we start talking about how you value me, if I'm going to accept that role of being the first piece to this big plan you guys have in mind, could I at least get a little bit extra in that contract? Could I at least get some more value from you guys on how you guys see me in terms of value in this offense, in this organization? If we're going to be okay with losing, if we're going to accept it just for now and expect bigger things later on, should I or will I get paid accordingly to how much, I've put into this organization by building it up or helping you guys build it up from the ground zero all the way to where it is right now? Similarly with Saquon, because Saquon was really that next piece to lead the Giants into this new era. Obviously, it didn't work out like that, but he, in my opinion, should have been paid according to how much work he put in to really keep the Giants relevant, for how much he did for that organization to keep them competitive at least and have something that opposing defenses have to worry about. Josh Jacobs, not to the level of Saquon, because Saquon obviously produced at a higher rate than him earlier on, but Josh Jacobs had that one great year with the Raiders where he was near the top in a lot of categories as a running back, but he also dealt with injuries, so there is that pushback from the Raiders in that aspect. But overall, I think having a guy like Josh Jacobs on their team and just alluding to the fact that they offered him less than what he was expecting when he said, "You want me to come back on a discount and lose," that part is where you start to see the disconnect with running backs. Like I said before, teams like to categorize all these running backs as they all are the same running back. And once they hit 27, all these running backs are going to be bad. They're all going to start producing 800, 700-yard seasons. And I'm not saying that Josh Jacobs was going to continue to put up 1,000-yard seasons like it was nothing, but I think you do have to give him a little bit more of the benefit of the doubt and offer him maybe close to 10, 9 maybe, to at least get him to think about it. It looks the way he was talking that they weren't really close to anywhere close to where he was thinking of where his value stood, and it seemed like he took it as a pretty easy choice to make at the end of the day in free agency, to move on, see what his market is out there, and the Packers didn't hesitate. There is a lot of salary cap gymnastics going on with this new contract that he has with the Green Bay Packers, but you do see that salary, you do see the guaranteed money coming in from the Packers, at least in that first year. It's definitely enough to move him over to Green Bay, and now you're left with Josh Jacobs and the Raiders splitting up in a very surprising way. But the question is now, did it actually... It looks bad the way Josh Jacobs is describing it, with the Raiders not valuing him as highly as he would have thought. But I asked myself, was it actually that bad at the end of the day for both parties? Because in Las Vegas's defense, it was a tough time for them as an organization. Josh Jacobs was really going to be that first piece to everything. But you're entering now into a period with Antonio Pierce as your head coach. And say you would have paid Josh Jacobs all that money to keep him there, would you have really been able to make that big of an impact at least this year and make this team a 10-win, 11-win team to really validate that contract? Now, moving on from Josh Jacobs, you can start thinking to the future. And you have Zamir White, who at least showed you something last year. You have Amir Abdullah. You also have Alexander Madison you brought in as well. All those guys in a running back for committee for the Las Vegas Raiders. It might not be as eye-popping as other rooms, as other situations are, but you start playing towards the future now, and you have that extra cap space to work in there. And at the end of the day, with that extra cap space, you could look to free agency next year and start looking at some more expensive quarterbacks, which is really the biggest thing that has been missing. I've been watching the Receiver series on Netflix. Only 3 episodes in actually, and you could see and sense the frustration from Devontae Adams through the screen, I swear, from Brian Hoyer, Jimmy Garoppolo, and the quarterback situation that he's had to deal with. You could see the frustration clear as day. He talks about it clear as day on that series. I recommend you guys going and checking that out, but that seems to be the main issue. And if you have to sacrifice Josh Jacobs at the end of the day and he goes on to a better situation in his eyes, I don't really see that big of a loser. It sounds crazy from the way he was talking about it, almost blasting the Raiders, but I think it almost in a way makes it better for everybody, for Josh Jacobs to move on to a better situation and the Raiders to maybe take another hit this year, but they have a really good chance next year of getting maybe Dak if he becomes available, maybe Tua. You never know in free agency. So overall, you take this one step back, but you could take 2 steps forward next year and really become a better team under Antonio Pierce heading into 2024 and then really in 2025 if this all works well. So not all negative. The way he was talking about it might seem like that, but this could be secretly a very beneficial thing for everybody if it all works out the way I'm planning it out. Obviously, it all has to happen like this, but you can start planning like this now with extra salary cap space. So that's that situation. Josh Jacobs not holding back, but the Raiders, I secretly think, are building something there. So I'm holding off until next year to see what they really do in free agency. But we have one more thing to talk about, one more running back to get to, Rachaad White. He has some pretty lofty goals in 2024. What are those goals, and can they lead to a back-to-back NFC South title in 2024? I'll give my thoughts on it when we return in just a few seconds. Thank you for joining me back here on the last segment of today's show, jumping from one running back in the AFC to another running back in the NFC South, that being Rachaad White. Rachaad White, clearly, as you guys can see, is targeting a 1,000-yard season for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, but with that being said, he didn't reach that last year, adding to the tally of, or I should say the drought of 1,000-yard rushers in Tampa Bay. But regardless of that, the Bucs still won the NFC South last year with a 9-8 record. The Saints were also 9-8, but you look at the rest of the division, not too competitive, with the Falcons finishing 7-10 and the Carolina Panthers 2-15. So yeah, really not a lot of competition there to really push them and show if they're truly a great team. They won the division, but how did they stack up with the rest of the NFC? It's hard to tell just based off of that division. They did win. They beat the brakes off of the Eagles in that first year, but again, the Eagles weren't really the Eagles in my eyes at that point. They were dealing with a lot of just coaching issues and a lot of just not being on the same page at that point. They were on a losing streak, so it wasn't really the same Eagles. So I won't give them that great of a rating on that win. They blew them out as they should have, but the next game that they played against the Lions, they did lose, but they made it a little bit close, but at the end of the day, it kind of showed where they were as a team. Not awful by any means because they made the playoffs, but you don't really get a good gauge of how good they are based off of that. So this year, now heading into it, Atlanta is looking a lot better, obviously with a new head coach, new OC, Drake London, Kyle Pitts, Kirk Cousins coming over, Darnell Mooney also, Bijan Robinson's second year. They're probably the favorite in a lot of people's eyes to take this division. Really not because of their defense, because of how great that offense is projected to be. People have them as the favorites, but the Buccaneers are the reigning champions, but they also didn't bring in too many new pieces on offense. They really focused on bringing back their usual stars like Baker, Mike Evans, Antoine Winfield. It's the right strategy, obviously, to bring back three of your biggest pieces, if not the three biggest. So that was a great thing that the Buccaneers did, but what can they do now to try and keep up with Atlanta? Something new, something to add this year in 2024 to try and keep up with everybody else's improvements. You know, the Panthers got better. The Saints, maybe not too much, but they're in a whole different category, stuck in this loop of trying to figure out their salary cap. So just talking about the Panthers and the Falcons, both of them got a lot better. So what can the Buccaneers do? So that's where we get to Rachaad White and his goals, because he has a goal of trying to reach 1,000 yards. That has not been done for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in almost 10 years. It's been 9 years since 2015 when Doug Martin rushed for over 1,400 yards for the Buccaneers. Since then, they've had 5 different running backs, but none of them have gotten over 1,000 yards in a single season. Rachaad White was close last year with 990, but he's eclipsed at least 1,000 yards before with the Arizona Cardinals, so he's trying to do that now with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. He briefly said on the topic about Tampa Bay's rushing game, he said, "When it comes to rushing, Tampa Bay has been down bad. My goal and what I expect me to do is to turn that around, and that's to be a top 10, top 15 to top 12 at the minimum." Obviously, there's not been a 1,000-yard rusher here in 9 years, and obviously I was 10 yards short of that last year. So being so close, it obviously stinks that he couldn't get to that mark. But talking about what that could really mean, why is that such a big thing? Well, to me, it's such a big deal because we're talking about really the big idea of determining if the Bucs are a good team. Can they compete with the improvements that the Falcons and the Panthers have made? Probably definitely the Panthers, because the Panthers aren't really close to competing, but you're really looking at the Falcons right now, those two as the main favorites to take that division. Why is this rushing aspect of it so important? Well, Tampa Bay, they won the division last year at 9-8, but they were dead last in rushing last season. They were averaging 88.8 yards per game and only had just over 1,500 yards total rushing as a team, but they still somehow won the division. And having Rachaad White at least reach 1,000 yards will be a big help, and hopefully he gets a lot more to that if he keeps improving. But I feel like where this team could really take that next step to stay toe-to-toe with the Atlanta Falcons is trying to find somebody else to complement Rachaad White. And not only does he get 1,000 yards, most likely, but you have another running back now adding 500 yards, 600 yards, hopefully 700 yards. And then that way, you're not so one-dimensional and having to overly rely on Baker, on Mike Evans, on Chris Godwin. Great weapons to have. Very fortunate to have that at your disposal. But during the playoffs, during some crucial moments of the game where you need a 3rd and 2, you need a 3rd and 3, you would like to have the possibility of running that ball rather than having the opposing defense know that this team is going to throw it because the rushing attack is not very good. And say, God forbid, Rachaad White gets hurt, then you really have no running game, and you can make this offense more dangerous by being so one-dimensional. Their next highest rusher on their team last year was Chase Edmonds, and he only had 176 yards. We've seen quarterbacks be leading rushers on teams that have way more yards than that. So that can't be the case heading into 2024. Like I mentioned, Tampa Bay already has the pass catchers to compete, at least with the Falcons. You look at Drake London, you have Mike Evans, Chris Godwin to Darnell Mooney or Kyle Pitts, both equally as talented. And then if you look at Baker and Kirk, very similar in the way that they've traveled to different teams and finding success late in their careers. So you're pretty equal at that standpoint. And I would say that the Tampa Bay Buccaneers have a better defense overall, arguably, than the Falcons do. The Falcons have great players like Jesse Bates, AJ Terrell on that side of the ball, but the Bucs equally have better or have had more productivity from that side of the ball. At least last year it was. So seeing some help come from the rushing attack to make the difference, I think could go a long way without having to add some big name players like the Falcons have on offense at least. Improving that running game and finding some depth at the running back position, hopefully this year, could be that one thing that separates you from just passing it 30, 40 times a game and hoping that you're efficient with it throughout 17 games. That's extremely hard to do. So finding that next level with Rachaad White, or trying to find another running back to at least, like, can you at least give me 400 yards? 176 is pretty bad. And Rachaad White stayed healthy for the majority of the year, so that's very fortunate, and that doesn't often happen for running backs. So you can't overly rely on that being the case year in and year out. You have to try and find some more help. And if Rachaad White, I expect him to eclipse 1,000 yards this year and break that record. But finding another running back to form a duo will really convince me that this Tampa Bay Bucs team could be a very solid team to win that division and at least make some noise in the playoffs. To build off of last year, because last year they started right. They really got on a hot streak to win that division and head into the playoffs, which was great. But expectations are now there within the fans, within everybody. So their standard has risen a little bit more, and they're expected to meet that in 2024. And I don't see that happening if they don't get some help for Rachaad White as well. But that's where it stands with the Bucs. They're trying to keep pace with the Atlanta Falcons. The Falcons could be more exciting, but at the end of the day, it's about winning that division. They could look at it different ways, and hopefully for the Bucs, they could do it through the running game. So that'll be interesting, that dynamic, and when they play each other should be very entertaining to watch. But with that being the case, that'll wrap it up for today's show. That is everything I have for you guys on today's episode. I want to thank you guys for tuning in to today's episode of the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast. Please remember to like, follow, and subscribe to the show, as well as following the network on all forms of social media. If you want to catch more of the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast, check out the 2 YouTube channels, the Podcast Network channel and the GSMC Sports Network channel, as well to check out YouTube Shorts All the live shows are recorded and posted on there, and individual segment videos as well. Tune in every weekday at 6:30 p.m. Eastern Time for more discussion and conversations around the NFL with me, Manny Maradiaga, as your host. Thank you guys for joining me. Hopefully you guys all have a great weekend. We're getting closer to training camp, so we're going to talk more about that next week on Monday, back here with me again.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet, damn, ain't that great.